Welcome in. It's my pleasure as the head of Special Collections and Archives to welcome you tonight. I'm Christina Zaman. And as we get into this fall season, and we're coming off of what some people have termed a hot labor summer, we continue into the fall with the UAW strike, SAG-AFTRA, Las Vegas hospitality workers are organizing, as well as 75,000 Kaiser Permanente workers threatening to strike. So despite that, we did just see the Writers Guild of America walk away with a deal that they are very happy with. But we also see more workers calling to organize among major corporations, something we really haven't seen lately. So we're here in another labor moment, right? This is another moment in history. Just the other day, and couldn't have predicted it at all, and I'm sure our panelists have some opinions on this, but we had our very first US president walk a picket line. So I feel like this is the perfect time for this exhibit to launch. We're taking a look back at two converging moments in history, the civil rights movement as well as unions, when unions were much stronger. And this is the perfect time to highlight that. Right now, we have still going on Black Lives Matter movement as well as other social justice movements and this labor movement. So I hope that you will find this panel and the exhibit engaging and informative. And I want to really thank the Council on Library and Information Resources for their generous support, grant funding to digitize these records. These were really a hidden collection, a hidden gem that had not been really accessed by anybody. And I think this is a really important set of records. And also our partners at the University of Maryland, which house the records of the AFL-CIO headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I also want to give a big thanks to our graduate student, Meg, who's out in the audience, who worked on researching and writing the exhibit narrative, as well as choosing the complementary images. I also want to thank Rachel Sinise, Bryce Bongiovanni, and Lynn Davies for all their work to digitize these collections. So could we all give them a round of applause? And the digital collection launched this week, so if you get a chance, please go to our digital collections page and you can see a lot of the materials and you can delve more deeply into what you see here in this exhibit. And finally, last but not least, I'd really like to thank Lisa Vallon, our Southern Labor Archivist, who will come up and give her remarks.
Thank you all for being here tonight. We truly appreciate your support for the Southern Labor Archive. I wanted to start by providing some context on the development of this exhibit. It started in early 2020 when we started to discuss applying for the Council of Library and Information Resources Hidden Collection Grant. I nominated the AFL-CIO Civil Rights Department records of the Southeast because they were rarely used by researchers, but they had such strong research value, and that they provided important context to many of today's issues. We submitted our first round application in May of 2020 before the murder of George Floyd and the summer of protests in support of Black Lives Matter. In light of these events, and after receiving feedback from reviewers, we reached out to the University of Maryland to offer a collaboration to incorporate some of the records from the national headquarters of the AFL-CIO, with the knowledge that these collections would shed important light and provide context to current events and movements. Today, we are witnessing an explosion of scholarly and public dialogue concerning labor and civil rights. Through this project, our combined holdings will add to the dialogue, increasing public and scholarly awareness of these issues and finding footholds from which we can continue examining and acting to address them. Access to this material will no longer be limited to a few elite scholars because the struggle for equality impacts all aspects of our society. These collections will provide primary source material for every scholarly discipline and for all ages. One of the ways we are raising awareness about the stories in these collections is through the creation of this exhibit, Fighting for Freedom, Labor and Civil Rights in the American South. This exhibit is split into roughly 3 time periods, the 1900s to the 1950s, the 60s, and then the 70s to present. We're looking to focus on exploring the intersection of civil rights and organized labor through the lens of these AFL-CIO Civil Rights Department records. And so we look at how the events had ripple effects, so such as school integration had upon the labor movement. We dive into A. Philip Randolph and organizing of the porters, the Charleston hospital worker strike, the forming of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Coretta Scott King and her push on full employment in the 70s. And we can see the fight for fair wages and safe working conditions that are explored in this exhibit still continue today. Our hope is to provoke thought and to encourage scholars, students, and the community to discover more stories about this crucial intersection. I would be remiss if I didn't briefly talk about the Southern Labor Archive. Our mission here in the Southern Labor Archive is to provide access to the experience of workers and their work in the South, especially the stories of minority workers whose experience are often overlooked and untold. We've been collecting these stories for the past 50 years, and we wouldn't be able to do this without the support of our donors. We collect across all industries, accept a wide variety of material that illustrate the important work that you do. It is imperative that we continue this effort, and we are seeing a new era in the labor movement. In order to continue our mission, we need your help. We're always looking for new collections that help tell the labor story. Please contact me, and I'm happy to speak with you about preserving your history. And this work isn't cheap. It's just me and 1 or 2 grad students, and so we need funds to continue the important work. And so please consider a donation to our Southern Labor Archive endowment. I now have my own section of thanks, so I would like to start with my graduate student, Meg, for such an excellent job in the research and creation of this exhibit. To Ms. Michelle Ashe for the creation of our stunning panels, and I appreciate your patience with our the black is too black and the red is too red part of this process. I want to thank my colleagues in Special Collections and Archives for their support in making this exhibit and event a success, and to our digital project staff for making these records available online. And of course, special thanks to my project partner, Rachel Sinise. I'm so proud of what we've accomplished together, and we really do have the perfect partnership. Without the support of our sponsors, we would not be able to do this work. And so I'd like to thank the Council of Library Information Resources for their support in the grant, the University of Maryland as our partner in this grant, the Digital Library of Georgia, and the New Georgia Encyclopedia for their partnership in the creation of the digital exhibit. And of course, the Georgia AFL-CIO, the United Steelworkers District 9, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 175, and Dennis Jenkins for their support of the creation of the physical exhibit. Now I want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Maurice Hobson, who's an associate professor of Africana Studies at Georgia State University. His latest book, The Legend of the Black Mecca, Politics and Class in the Making of Modern Atlanta, challenges the primary narrative of how the city's power structure has treated poor and working class Black Americans. Dr. Hobson has long been a supporter and friend of the archive, and so we are so excited to have him moderate this panel. It's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Eric Richardson, who's the executive director of the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council, which is a coalition of 60 affiliated unions that advocates for the workers' rights and the welfare of their families throughout the state. We have Dr. Robert Woodrum, who's an associate professor of history and political science here at Georgia State University. His extensive research explores the tension between race and labor through the lens of economic and technological changes in the South throughout the 20th century. And we have Deborah Scott, who's our chief executive officer of the Georgia Strategic Alliance for New Directions and Unified Policies, or Georgia Stand Up, which is an alliance of community and labor activists dedicated to advancing equality and civil rights. Ms. Scott has been recognized by the Obama White House for her dedication to community-based organizing, which has had a significant impact on the lives of Georgians and those living throughout the South. So let's give them a round of applause. And I will turn it over to you.
All right, can you all hear me? Uh-oh, we got feedback. Oh.
share a mic. Okay.
Well, good afternoon. I think it's still afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I am grateful and honored to be here with you all this evening talking about labor and the American South. As a point of privilege, I want to kind of give you all a concept on how I began to be involved with labor and labor unions. I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and in my first year of graduate school, we unionized the graduate students and created the graduate employee organization. We struck and we won benefits for graduate students. Now we're talking about graduate students to get the wraparound services in terms of medical aid, in terms of medical care, to get opportunities to have school for their children and all kinds of different things. And so that's when I was really exposed to this conversation around unions, because I grew up in Alabama, and that was just not a conversation that anyone had. And so I want to kind of put this in context for you all, and then we'll ask some really cool questions of this august panel that I'm a part of. Since before the founding of the United States, the issue of labor has always been at the fore of American democracy and civility, whether it has been through indigenous folk, pilgrims, African communities. Wars have been fought, discriminating laws have been passed, and communities have been displaced, disfranchised, criminalized, and demonized over the ability to earn a fair and equitable wage. Labor is at the core of American democracy. And if we understand democracy as articulating the needs and voices of a consensus, we must consider collective bargaining, because it is at the fore of ensuring fair and equitable earnings. What we're talking about here is being fair. This evening's panel has been curated and attached to this exhibit that we see in this room to demonstrate and allow for the lived experiences of union organizers to be articulated at the eye level. This panel is an all-star cast. And so without further ado, I want to ask some questions. And well, before I do that, I need to put some context in some things. I was talking to Lisa, and I may have sent the email to some of you all on the email thread today. As I said, I want to kind of give a proper context when we talk about civil rights. Oftentimes, in a history class, when you say civil rights, people believe that it's all about Martin Luther King, okay? So they assume in what is called the classical phase of civil rights, which starts with Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, and supposedly ends in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 coming out of Selma, Alabama, or with the assassination of Dr. King. But historians don't necessarily see it that way. And the thing is that civil rights, as we understand it, starts in what we know of as the United States in 1526, when Africans were brought to the coast of Savannah, what is now Savannah, and we are still in the middle of a civil rights movement today. So what I'm talking about here is that there is, in most historians' opinions, there is no pre or post civil rights. It all works together, and I can show you all how this works. I mean, if you want to think about it in this regard, 1790, the first census, that becomes an issue of who's counted as a citizen. That's a civil rights issue. The 1808, the outlawing of transatlantic slavery, that's a civil rights issue. The Amistad Rebellion and the fact that these Africans were considered to be property in particular kinds of ways, the U.S. didn't know what to do, that's a civil rights issue. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 is a civil rights issue. The Civil War is a civil rights issue. What I'm saying here is that these have always been around. And of course, here in Atlanta, Georgia, when Booker T. Washington gave the speech that W.B. Du Bois would later deem as the Atlanta Compromise, and gives the language that is used to codify segregation into law, separate but equal, that is a civil rights issue. So what I'm saying is, when we move into this and talk about what's going on, we know and understand that at the fore of understanding American civil and human rights, labor has been at the front of that. And so with this being said, let me go into the first question. With the recent ending of the Hollywood writer strike, so that was as of yesterday, which was a 148-day work stoppage, and with the current United Auto Workers strike, where 2 days ago, American President Joe Biden sided with the auto workers, and the continuing efforts of warehouse workers, visual affects artists, first responders, restaurant workers, and amongst many others to unionize. There's an issue right now to where we're trying to get an understanding of what the people need. The people's idea of what a union looks like, who can join, and what it can do are changing. What effects do you think this recognition could have on the momentum or power of unions in the months or years to come? So, what I'm asking is, there's been a major moment. Here's a Kairos moment for us to talk about labor unions and what that means, particularly in the American South. What do you think that is going to look like in the years to come?
My parents and grandparents faced as far as labor and wages. The Great Migration took a lot of the labor that was being abused in the South and transferred to the North where they had a better chance. And we took advantage of that. But now is a time when we need to re-energize the South and make it right. Because it was wrong at that time, it should not continue. And we as trade unionists, I will call it, have to do a better job of organizing in the South, educating people here in the South what labor is all about, helping people to stand up for their working rights. And we need to have a coalition of just not labor. We need to include faith, community, politics, and we need to work in unison to change the South. And we've already started that. And you'll be hearing more from the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council on that account. And we hope that you all will participate in some of the programs we're going to bring forth, and education programs here in the South to educate workers and all people. You're not taught in high school anymore about labor. You don't have vocational schools anymore in labor. You know, we have apprenticeship programs where you get paid day one as you learn your craft. And once you get that certification, you can work anywhere in the world, and guess what? On top of that, you don't have an education bill that you've got to pay back for the rest of your life.
Well, I'd like to get down in the weeds with Randolph, actually, for a little bit on that struggle, because I think that shows a lot of the black struggle in the labor movement, really. You know, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, they fight a lot of battles with people, with white unionists and with white company, very powerful white company owners. They fight the Pullman Company, one of the most anti-union companies ever in American history, the company that crushed Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union. If you study that strike, the Pullman Porter strike, the Pullman Company strike, they make it so that they get the federal courts to issue injunctions against Debs and the union where they can't even speak about the union in public. And it's amazing. They all end up in prison. Debs converts to socialism. They crush the union. Randolph built a union in that company, and it was an amazing fight. But 2 years earlier, he had to wage a similar fight, not within the union, within the company, but within the labor movement itself, within the American Federation of Labor. You know, getting a charter from the American Federation of Labor was a huge battle for the Pullman Porters. So there was this struggle within the labor movement for black rights, and then for black rights in the outside world with the companies, and it's an equally vicious struggle at times. And then you think about Randolph when he gets in the Oval Office with Roosevelt, and if you read accounts of that meeting, it's got to be the first time in American history when black activists tell a white president, to even be in the room, is a big deal. No, Mr. President. We don't want you to call your buddies in corporate offices. We don't want that. We want an executive order, 8802. We want that order. They get the order, And, Walter White calls it the Second Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, that's a huge victory, and it shows the struggle that black workers have had to go through. But it also shows the amazing victories at times. And then, of course, there's Randolph again in 1963. And that battle's being fought with what? The Kennedy administration and the sort of lackadaisical approach to civil rights on the part of the Kennedy administration, and forcing John F. Kennedy to embrace the movement finally, or at least embrace the Civil Rights Bill. So it's an amazing struggle, and I think it shows the complexity of what black workers have to struggle with.
This is good. So on that thread, we have to talk about sometimes the elephant in the room, the racism within the trades as well, and the fact that, it's not all peaches and cream in the labor movement as well. So the history of the CIO fighting with the AFL, and I see Dr. Laporte here. This is a unique history, and it's still going on. So the fact that we have a woman president of the AFL-CIO, Liz Schuler, and we have a woman president of the Georgia AFL, Yvonne Brooks Taylor, and we have a woman president of the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council, all at the same time. This is a moment in history. And so part of what the message is we have to continue to work together. Even when we fight within, the goal is for us to come out fighting not each other, but the issues that are out there that are dividing us. So again, this is about workers organizing and working together for their power. I think once workers realize that they really can outnumber their employers, and if they really organize and stand with the community and not divide the community for their own issues or their own contracts, I think that we would be much stronger together, and I hope that that plays out in this election.
Well, let's bring it to Atlanta. And I've done a lot of work on Atlanta, but I want to kind of put something in a context for you all that puts us right in from the 1950s until around the 1980s. You all talked about black folks returning south. As a historian, I created this political theory called the Black New South. And that conversation that we're talking about really stems from what happens in Alabama. It extends from what happens in Birmingham, which creates the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which buttresses the 14th Amendment and grants equal protection and due process under the law, meaning that if you're out on a picket line, the police cannot walk out there and hit you in your head and just do it because you're a protected citizen. And then it comes through what comes out of Selma, Alabama, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which buttresses the 15th Amendment and grants universal suffrage. So we're talking about citizenship and voting. That's the political side of things. But let's talk about the industrial side of things. And we have to talk about what is called the Sun Belt boom. Okay? It is during this time that we see industry that realizes that the costs are shifting, and they move to the American South because of better weather and because of cheaper tax incentives. They give tax incentives to come across the American South. The Sun Belt boom goes from Virginia all the way across the nation to California. And so we see this move, but what we also see during this moment is a shift from an industrial economy to an information-based economy. And the public schools they don't have an education that allows for folks to be able to compete in that information age. And so this recapitulates the American South in a different kind of context, in a post-1965 context. So with that being said, we're going to do a deeper dive into Atlanta in just a second. What have you all seen, particularly here in Atlanta, in terms of labor organizing and looking at unions that has been extremely effective, and what do you think that we can do better? And I'm talking about there are numerous industries where we see organized labor. What have you seen that has worked? What have you seen that hasn't worked? And how can we rectify those situations as we live in Atlanta, Georgia today?
Well, first off, I have to say, as I said earlier, unions in the South is a voluntary thing. What I did find in moving from the North to the South, it was easier for me to find employment here in Atlanta than it was for the people who were native Atlantans. And that was based somewhat on education and somewhat on a lot of prejudice. By me being a so-called foreigner or not from Atlanta, I had a different work experience. So when I went on interviews, now some I went on and, people were intimidated by my education and my former salary in New York. So I sought a union. I sought companies that had unions. Now, at first, I was hired by Southern Bell, and they were represented by the Communication Workers of America. A lot of the guys that I got hired with were from the North, and we started going to union meetings. Now, I'm going to tell you, my first union meeting, somebody went out and put a knife in my tire. I was very angry. I was ready to turn that place out, and so were my friends. So we got together and made sure we went to these union meetings in force and had our voices heard. What I think is, and this is still true today, folks have a fear that if they lose power, those that come into power are going to treat them the same way they treated everybody else. That has never been my wish, my thought, or sentiment. When we get in there in power, we want to have things done right and fair for everybody, for every worker, because we're all brothers and sisters in this movement. So we've got to change the mindset and the culture. Some of our trade unions, yes, they're very exclusive, and they put roadblocks in the way so that you can't achieve. I'm also the president of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. We were formed when the AFL-CIO decided that they were going to back Richard Nixon for president. And we opposed that, and we organized. And we told them not just no, but hell no. The AFL-CIO backed down and refused to endorse anyone for president. So began the Coalition of Trade Unions. During that period of time, from then until now, we have trained black workers on how to become officers in their unions, how to be participants, and also to work within the community to raise the level of education, job training, politics, and so forth. But it is not exclusive to just black workers. We're inclusive of everybody. So anybody can join CBTU. Just seek us out.
Well, when I think of what Maurice was talking about, the Sun Belt, I study Birmingham and Mobile, Alabama, which are slightly different places. So, we think of the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, for example, the Midwest, and Detroit and Chicago and the big steel and automobile factories. And, the idea is that the Rust Belt declines as the Sun Belt grows. But if you study Birmingham, you get a kind of different picture, because Birmingham is coal, iron, and steel. That's the core of it. And, black workers being involved in the United Mine Workers of America, that union was brought in by black workers. No question about it. They were the majority in the mines, and the mines, if you look at the coal fields around Birmingham where they have the mines, it's those mines with lots of black workers that bring the union in. The steel workers, it's not a majority black union, but there's a healthy minority of black workers in that union who are crucial. The shipyards in Mobile, same thing. Black workers are always with the cause, down with that struggle. But the problem is, after World War II, these industries begin to decline. And the decline is fast and furious, and it hits all of these different industries. And so that in a place like Alabama, where you have a vibrant union movement. You have the biggest union movement in the South. It was the most organized part of the South, and it's hard for people to believe, but Alabama was that state, in particular the area around Birmingham and to a lesser extent Mobile. This was the heart of the union movement in the South in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. But that industrial economy bottoms out, and it bottoms out, I was noticing some of the things we've been talking about, it bottoms out right about the time that the Civil Rights Movement reaches its height. So you get the legislation, you get the Civil Rights Act, which is going to open up more jobs to African Americans, and what happens? Those jobs go away. They start to decline. And so it's a tricky thing, and it's a real interesting, this is how history can help us understand technological change. There are people who are involved in that, who benefit from that, and a lot of people who don't. And in Birmingham, places like that, you see it. We have a Rust Belt right here in the South, which it kind of is obscured by real estate and things that boom, and they kind of cover up some of that. But it's a real struggle for people.
I can if you want. We'll take questions in just a second, but I can go to another question because I think you would be great to answer this question. Let's take it even deeper to Atlanta. Maynard Holbrook Jackson Jr. Now, I'm going to tell you all something about Maynard Jackson. Maynard Jackson is a sacred cow in this city. If you go places and talk slick about Maynard Jackson, you might get hit in the head. It doesn't matter if they're working class, if they're poor, wealthy, or whatever, whatnot, because Maynard Jackson did a lot, but he was complicated. He had to be complicated. And the question that I'm about to ask is a question around activism versus governing, because you can't do both at the same time. Maynard Jackson was born in Dallas, Texas, but he was a fifth-generation Georgian, so he was from Atlanta, technically. I mean, he moved here as a child. I went to Morehouse, did his thing. But during what we know of as the classical phase of the Civil Rights Movement, Maynard was in law school, and he was in Boston, North Carolina. He moves back to Atlanta in 1965, and in 1968, he and his then wife, Bunny, had a brand new baby. Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th. I think his daughter was born on April 8th. And in June of that year, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Maynard Jackson decided that he needed to do something to extend civil rights and decided to run for the Senate against Herman Talmadge. That's a whole thing right there. But this is where I'm going with this. When Maynard Jackson loses that Senate race, but in 1971, as vice mayor, he marches with the strikers, the sanitation strikers here in Atlanta. In 1977, as mayor, he fires the hell out of the sanitation workers. With this being said, and us being in this city that likes to position itself as the cradle of the civil rights movement, I would argue that it is not. I've written a whole book on why it is not. But in a city that does have real promise and does offer particular, ideas about where we are and what we're doing, what can Atlanta do? And I know you're ready for it.
Well, so Maynard Jackson was one of my bosses and heroes as well, but he is a complicated historical figure, but he was a complicated man, but he also was a brilliant man, right? And so declaring that the airport would not be built without black workers was a bold move, which changed the trajectory of Atlanta, which changed and made a black middle class that did not exist before. So it's complicated because you have this complication between black middle class and black upper middle class and those that were educated from the Atlanta University Center like myself, and those that had not have or cannot have and do not have the same opportunities that we have. So it's a complicated issue between black and white and green. And when you look at the business community that really runs Atlanta, hi y'all, I see y'all in the back, which really runs Atlanta, it's really complicated. So, a lot of the decisions that were made here during Maynard's days, I remember days of riding with him and him going to meet with people, and he would say it's all about a compromise here. It's all about a compromise. Everything we do here in Atlanta is a compromise, and there's a winner and a loser. And so sometimes you have to hedge your bets on who's going to win and who's going to lose. But one of the most profound things he did was the airport, which led to the minority participation in most of the contracts that are here in Atlanta. But that also leaves out those workers that don't have those same protections in a union, because a lot of those contractors hired other people or subcontracted the work out themselves, and then the poor continue to get poorer while some black middle class got richer. So it's a complicated place of 40 years of black elected officials that have been in power at the same time the city is getting poorer, at the same time it's getting richer. So what can we do? We can organize. One of the things that labor and community did together was the Clayton County transit expansion. We sit over the train station, but if you can believe, a couple of years ago, there was no train that went to the world's busiest airport, or excuse me, was no bus that went to the world's busiest airport because the Clayton County had stopped their bus system. The bus system had gone belly up. And it was with community and organized labor working together. And I see MARTA representatives here and union folks here, ATU. It's organizing together that allowed folks to vote for their 1 cent sales tax in order to get into the MARTA system. But those struggles of transportation and education and access to opportunity, as this is the railroad town, this was Terminus, and I looked down and literally the city of Atlanta was started right here, and this was the home of all kinds of prostitution. So if you look at the history of Atlanta and you look at, you know, the economy that we had then and have now, it was based on the on transportation, the railroad, and prostitution, I believe, and conventions, right? And it still is in some ways, right?
In some ways.
But it really is about people working together and organizing together. So there's some successes out there. There's some failures out there as well. But when you work together on transportation issues or affordable housing issues or issues that affect people's education, I think that's where the nugget of collectivity is. So it's a complicated place. Birmingham, we stole the airport from Birmingham. I think it would be a different situation had Birmingham had the regional airport that Atlanta has. But there is, with the World Cup coming here in 2025, we're going to face the same things that we faced during the Olympics. What do we do with the poor people? Where will people live? What will happen with our traffic? What will happen with our workers? And so now's the time to organize around those issues, because, you know, we're under attack. And you know what I always say, if our rights are under attack, what will we do? We're going to stand up and fight back, right? So community benefits, project labor agreements, worker agreements are all necessary in this moment as we rebuild.
And Ms. Scott, I'm so glad you put that in context like that, because, and the reason I presented that question is that we can't deny what Maynard Jackson has done in a city like Atlanta. I mean, he gave 35% of city contracts to minority contractors. And when you do the math, between 1973 and 1994, between he and Andrew Young, we're talking $10 billion. So we're talking $3.5 billion going to black folk. It produces a black middle class and creates this notion of the Black Mecca. But again, it doesn't mean that it trickles down to everyone. And that's the complicated nature of this. This is going to be the last question I'm going to ask. I'm going to read it. It's quite long. But I will ask this question. We'll let the panelists answer, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Many of the famous labor strikes of the 20th century, and as I think about this, let me just throw this out there. We got to say some names in here. We can probably do it after we do this. But if there are labor activists, union organizers who are near and dear to your heart who are no longer here, say those names. Well, let's say some names. Go ahead.
Reverend James Orr.
Dorothy Bolden. Lehman Hood, Willie Bolden, Bill Lucas, Susie Laborde,
Oh my goodness.
Ethel Matthews.
I see you calling the list.
I do Atlanta. And the reason I want us to put that out there is because these are folks who were on the ground, who not only worked in terms of union organizing, but also education organizing, making sure that children had the opportunity to go to school for 8 hours, 5 days a week.
That's right.
That stopped them from going into sharecropping, which is debt peonage.
That's right.
So putting that in context right there. Now let me get back to this question.
And most of them are women, by the way.
Come on.
Okay.
Well, folks with good sense know that women have put the gas in the tank the whole time. So let's do some snapping some fingers, a round of applause or something. So, but many of the famous labor strikes of the 20th century, such as the Charleston Hospital Workers Strike, detailed in the exhibit, lasted months or even longer, as management refused to bargain with its workers. As we see the consequences of technological changes in healthcare, education, transportation, and the arts, and as attacks on American civil rights play out across the middle and working classes, do you see a lesson in the activism of the civil rights movement that you would bring to the attention of civil rights and labor activists today?
Here I am. As you all can probably tell, I'm probably the only non-professor up here. And I'll say that it is time, and we are in the process of bringing that roundtable back together. This coming Saturday, the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council is going to sponsor a coalition strategy meeting, and it's the very first one with all of these organizations that have been mentioned to figure out how we're going to attack this problem. And it's been a long time since we brought these folks together. I know you mentioned Reverend James Orange. When I was a young worker, the Orange family organized the Martin Luther King Jr. March. And it's a march and not a parade, folks. But as part of that committee, one of my jobs was cooking in the back for the workers the marches when they came off the strike. Well, Reverend Orange walked in the room and he said, "Hey, leader." And now I was the only one in the room, and I'm looking around like, who are you talking to? He said, "You." Reverend Orange had a way of speaking to you that brought things out of you that you didn't even know you had. We miss him, but he's not here. I just heard a poem by a gentleman named Hank Stewart that said, "It's our time. If we don't do something, it's our fault." If we don't do something, folks, it is going to be our fault. So, that being said, we have to get civil rights and labor back together. I know my dad was a member of UAW, and when Walter Reuther, who was head of UAW, joined with Martin Luther King, that was a new day in the union of civil rights and labor. And it has moved on to a point, and it stalled for a minute because of the economy and the things we gave up to keep businesses running. Unions are not created to bring down companies. We want all our companies to succeed. We're professional people that do a good job, and we need to be compensated for the excellence that we bring to those products that you consume. And like I said, I'm not the professor, so I'm gonna let these more learned folks expound.
Deborah, do you want to take this performance?
I think one of the things that we can, or some of the things that we can learn from the past is if you look back on the photos of folks back in the 60s, they were young people. And so investing in the next generation and the now generation is essential. So it's not about saying, your ancestors died for you in order to do this. It's really about what rights are you losing? The right to your body, the right to your land, the right to your check, the right to your, the way in which who you love and how you love. And so tapping into the rage that our young people have and getting them educated and organized is the key. So it's not about telling them the history and not being out there when they're in the streets when George Floyd gets killed or anyone else in Atlanta gets killed. It's about showing them that you're here for them and that you respect them as young people, and teaching them the strategies that we used, not just in the 60s, but in the 80s. We were still marching, trying to get a Martin Luther King holiday. We were trying to get South Africa to divest, or these businesses here in Georgia to divest from South Africa. I was trying to get Nelson Mandela out of jail when I was a student organizer. So part of teaching the history is showing the history. My building is called the Movement Center, and it's full with history, full of artifacts on the walls, so that when we're there with our young people, they are realizing that it's not just the past. Their picture is on the wall as well. It's because it's about now. It's about people working together to organize. So I would say the lesson from the past is let's not keep repeating it by being divided, but let's continue to organize together, putting the center on young people and funding them, giving them space to figure it out, but also making sure that we hold the line and not divide each other. I think one of the heartbreaking things that happens when you work in coalitions is some coalition members are stronger than others, and they get their part of a contract or their part of the deal, and they leave the rest of us out. And so it's holding the line internally, making sure that there are real agreements before we come out with an agreement publicly, that we hash it out behind closed doors like they used to do in church basements and union basements. We need to do that again, but we need to do it not just as a transactional relationship because a union needs the community. It's because we care about what happens to Mrs. Johnson that's sleeping under the bridge. It's because we care about the woman that may be making three jobs work or trying to make that work for her 3 kids. It's about getting someone in an apprenticeship program like ours, which is Trade Up, or whether it's about making sure that we're ready for the next iteration of these green jobs, energy efficiency jobs. And it's about, is AI going to take over when we haven't even educated our population? So part of what we're trying to do is to make sure people realize that the movement is now. It wasn't the past. We love the artifacts, and I can't wait to come and start pulling some of this data, but it really is about to inform what we do now, because we have to fight. And I love the title of that. It really is fighting for freedom. So if we think that we're in it, this is not a sideline sport. We're not gonna be able to sit on the sidelines. You're gonna have to choose a side. Are you for workers, and are you for the people, or are you not? And you're gonna have to show up that way. So this is a moment, a clarion call to get involved, get active, whether you're here for a class or you're here for your job. You have a purpose, and you have something to do. So the academic credentials that you have are not just for you, it's for your community, and it's for you to give back. So what I would say, if your rights are under attack, what will you do? I hope you will stand up and fight back.
Well, just building on that, just for a quick minute, as I was getting ready for this event, I read up on the Alabama State AFL-CIO, and a man named Barney Weeks. I remembered reading about him many years ago. I revisited all that, and at the Alabama AFL-CIO, when the civil rights movement happened after the Brown decision, Weeks became the president of that state labor body, and he starts to do things that really make a lot of white members really angry, so much so they leave, such as he begins to loosen up on segregation at the meetings. They begin to have integrated meetings, and this is in the 50s and 60s. They lose something like 1/3 of their members. The AFL-CIO's embrace of civil rights, we were talking about Walter Reuther and Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph, and that happens. Well, that was really unpopular with a lot of white workers in Alabama who bolted the state AFL-CIO, who tried to form various federations of white workers, the Southern Federation of Labor, all of this. Weeks and many other leaders stuck to their guns, They said, no, we're not going back. We're gonna stand and fight. Exactly what you're talking about, Ms. Scott. Stand and fight. And as a result, those labor federations, these rival groups, all fade away. They're all gone. But the Alabama AFL-CIO is still there. And Alabama still, it's lower unionization rate, but in the South, it's still high compared to many southern states. Like North Carolina, I think it's even higher than Georgia's rate. Last time I checked, it's been a minute. But that's a result of the stand that a lot of these leaders took in the face of overwhelming opposition at times. So that sort of gives me hope that I think the labor movement has learned these lessons, has learned the lessons of people like Weeks, but the local leaders we've been talking about here in Atlanta, other places. This is part of the labor movement now. Just last week, we had out at my campus at Georgia Perimeter, which is part of Georgia State now, we had an LGBTQ plus labor movement forum and for the students. And it was amazing to me how many labor unions have LGBTQ plus caucuses. And I think that comes out of the struggle we're talking about. Labor has really opened up to many different things because of what the impact the civil rights movement had on labor in a positive way. Sure, initially there was this pushback from a lot of white workers, but over time, the struggle, what is that, Maurice, I know you know the quote, the arc of justice bends, but it bends towards justice. It's a long bend, whatever, I'm messing that up. Yeah, you see it with labor, I think.
Well, at this time, we're going to open the floor to questions. And the first question is,
Professor, I don't need a mic. Yeah, okay. You want me to go up there? Okay, right here is good. My name is Phil Laporte. I'm the Director Emeritus of the Labor Studies Program. I have traveled Georgia over the past 30 years teaching classes. And your question about what works and industrial change, I just have a few examples cited in Metro Atlanta and Georgia. At one point, there were 10,000 UAW members in Metro Atlanta. Hapeville, Local 882, Lakewood Plant, Local 34, and the Dorville Plant, Local 10. I was there the day that the trucks came to load the assembly machines to take them out of the Dorville plant to Mexico. 882 Hapeville was the most productive auto assembly plant in North America, bar none. Toyota, all the other international companies, Hapeville was the most productive. However, because that product first was assembled in Chicago, Ford had to take that model, the Ford Taurus, best-selling car in the United States, and back to Chicago it went. Broke the heart of thousands of people. And that plant has a rich history of the civil rights movement. In fact, at one point, there was an aptitude test in order to get hired. And a group of black activists hired students from Morehouse University to come and take the test. They did, and they passed, and they got job offers. And the activists said, hey, what are you guys doing? Go back to college. Oh, no, did you see the salaries? Are you kidding me? We're taking these jobs. Well, later, one Clarence Williams, who was executive director at one point at the Georgia AFL-CIO, he got hired in. And he was standing by the time clock. And there were 4 white workers, elderly men like me. And he said, what's the matter? Well, we can't find our time card. Well, what's your name? Michael Green. Oh, Mr. Green, this is your card right here. What's your name? Charles White. Mr. White, this is your card. They couldn't read. You have to pass the test, but they were illiterate, but they were white. So they had worked there for years. What did Clarence Williams do? He said, Mr. Green, I'm going to put a square on your card. Tomorrow when you come, you look for that square and you'll find it. And he did for all 4 of those men. Later, when he ran to be committeeman, he always had the support of those 4 and many others. So Clarence Williams is a name I want to call out. I want to call out E.L. Abercrombie. He integrated the laundry workers in Atlanta. He led a year-long strike, and the issue was paying black workers at the same wage rate as white workers. And he provided strike benefits weekly to those workers on strike. E.L. Abercrombie, his interview is here at the Southern Labor Archives. It is well worth reading. So the paper workers, and now, what works? The paper workers saw an influx of production plants in the Southeast, Georgia and Alabama. And when they built a new plant, what management would do is they would take the skilled craftsmen to go over and set up the plant, get the wiring done, and they did at every new plant they opened. That became the organizing committee for the paper workers. So every plant that they went, they had a built-in organizing committee. That worked very effectively. The brewery industry, we got to talk about beer, right? Albany, Georgia, Dougherty County, Southeast Georgia. Boy, you want to talk hostile towards unions. Well, the machinists union said we're going to organize that plant. And what they did is they took workers from the Lockheed Martin plant, Local 709, and sent them down to Albany to serve as the organizing committee, and they were successful because they were able to point out that we negotiate wages, and they would bring the contract with them and show them what a union could do. That was a successful tactic. And finally, Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser beer. They built a brewery in Cartersville, Georgia. Whose hometown was Cartersville, Georgia? The governor of Georgia, Joe Frank Harris. He was a Baptist and a teetotaler, so the Anheuser-Busch executives had to come at night underneath the Capitol to meet with the governor. He didn't want to be associated with a beer company. Well, lo and behold, I did the card check at that Anheuser-Busch plant for the Teamsters Union. And part of the agreement was there would be neutrality and a card check. A card check works so much more effectively. And so when we talk about community benefits, that is one of the issues they want included is neutrality in a card check. That works in terms of organizing. And the key to that was every other brewery that Anheuser-Busch had in the United States was organized by the Teamsters Union. And every beer can had on it Union Made. And they said, if you don't recognize the union here in Cartersville, Georgia, there's going to be trouble in Merrimack, New Hampshire. There's going to be trouble in St. Louis, Missouri. There's going to be trouble in Florida and in California. That type of leverage works. So I'm sorry for being so long-winded, but I think those are answers to your questions. Thank you.
Questions? Questions? Don't be shy. Your family in here. If you don't get it right, it'll get you right.
What are these, including you as well, what are some of the examples that you've seen as far as the South being anti-labor?
I also, I was at one point in time the political director for the Communication Workers of America, and therefore also their lobbyists. And on well, we call it the Demon Dome because there's so many demons running around up under that dome. You better pray before you step your foot in there. But if they even heard union, they were anti. And later on, I found out they got jobs for some of their sons in companies that had unions because they knew what kind of benefits they had. Now, as a lobbyist, you have conversations with folks that don't necessarily hit the news or the floor. They say one thing in a chamber and then go vote a different way than your conversation went with them. But they are galvanized on that hill to be anti-union, including those folks that lobby for the Chamber of Commerce. So a lot of those elected officials, you need need to have a conversation with them if you're a constituent before you vote for them and find out what their stands are. But it is very, very anti-union here in Georgia, especially up under that gold dome. And those are the policymakers. They've tried to pass so many different laws to stop us from protesting, going out on strike. One year, we actually had to, politics makes for strange bedfellows. And one year, we actually had to partner with the Tea Party in order to stop a bill that was going to be detrimental for us to express our First Amendment rights. And they felt the heat as well. And we formed a coalition to stop that bill because they had legislators that they had supported that said, if you don't stop this, you're not going to be in office again. But that's how we work behind the scenes in closed rooms, sometimes not under the dome, in other places, to get things worked out for everyday people. And those are the extremes that we're willing to go to in order to secure your future, and we'll continue to do so. But why they're so anti-union? They're just not educated, but we're in the process of doing that. We held a forum a couple of years ago for the state legislators, and all of them were invited so that they can learn what unions are all about. And we had about 70 legislators attend. Unfortunately, most of them were Democrats, but everybody was invited.
Any other questions?
Good evening. First of all, thank you for such a great and engaging panel discussion. I really enjoyed it. My question is, in an age when people are already fearful of losing their jobs to technology, how do you encourage people to unionize without the fear of speeding up a process of losing their jobs that they think is coming already?
So this question can go in a lot of different directions. I mean, we're talking about AI, and we're talking about a lot of different things. There are a lot of different components to it. I think I was watching the news or something this morning, and it stated that, I can't remember the number of jobs that are going to be lost due to AI and all kind of different things in the future. I mean, but it was a lot of jobs. And so the question that you're asking as a professor, this always comes up with professors because with this chat GPT and all kind of different things, I mean, they believe it's difficult to catch students cheating. It's not. You just have to outthink the algorithm, okay? You have to be able to give a student a question right there.
If I may, what's going on right now is going to shape the entire future of working society. Unions have come together to support workers, their rights. They always say, unions built the middle class. Yes, it did. And we've had an erosion of that because unions have given up so much to keep corporations alive. And now they're making record profits and don't want to return those things that we've earned over the years back to us. And we're saying, not just no, but hell no. Every worker, work has dignity. Work has value. We're in a society now that knows the cost of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. But labor is going to be the tip of the spear. That's going to change all of that. And each and every person in this room is a worker in some shape, form, or fashion. And that goes all the way to the domestic workers, to the professors, to even middle management for that matter. They don't understand. But it will be clear by the time this present labor movement is over.
All right, well, what I wonder about is, I think this moment with Biden on the picket line, there's sort of two things I think about. Like, that's the first time a president was on the picket line? That's kind of amazing to me. And it was Joe Biden that did it. I thought, well, didn't he drive up in the car he had, or something, and maybe shake a few hands? But this is the first time. So it is a moment. There is an upsurge there. You read in the paper, more people filing for elections, strikes, more workers organizing. We have workers from Starbucks organizing, from Amazon organizing, places they said would never be organized. And it reminds me of 1932 a little bit. And 1932, right at the start of the New Deal, was a symbolic moment in our history. You get early legislation. It kind of doesn't work very well for workers, actually, that first round of legislation. But after a bunch of defeats, the upsurge continues. The workers force the political system to adapt. These business leaders who were heroes 10 years earlier, during the Depression, they were disparaged. People didn't look up to them. They had caused the Depression, not the workers. And the workers felt that they had the solution. And what I wonder, just listening to what Eric was saying, I wonder if we're in another moment like that, where workers now, average people who made this country, are now saying, hey, people need to listen to us. And how are they going to get listened to? They can give small donations, they can do all that, but by organizing, by working together collectively, that's the question to me moving forward. Will this happen? Because unless people get organized, we had 1934, the great textile strike, which the workers were horribly defeated. One of the largest walkouts, if not the largest walkout we've ever had. The workers lost that, but we got the National Labor Relations Act out of that. We got formalized bargaining structure and momentum, and a modern labor movement comes out of that. So is this a moment like that? I think it's an open question, but it really is an exciting time for labor.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Scott, and I'm happy to be here. And I would submit this is not a moment, this is a movement, and the movement continues. And it really is not about the organizations as much as it's about power for the workers. I think the workers have been under the thumb or under the knee for so long that it's time to rise up, literally. And so whether it's organizing, strategizing, and mobilizing for their power, for their health care, for child care, this is the home of the domestic workers, right? Dorothy, right down the street, right? So this is where it should begin, this is where it should continue, and I think because this is the South, and particularly because of Atlanta's unique history of this compromised muddle of a mess of a city that is, as Harvey Newman always says, hard work and hot air, that we have come together to grow this city, but we've left the people behind, that there are people living under the bridges and under the trees, but yet they're working 2 or 3 jobs and can't afford to live in this city. I think it's time for a workers' revolt. And so what we're seeing is an organized moment where people are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Let's do a little history here. In your opinions, whether it's historical or your lived experience, why is the American South so anti-union?
In the 1880s, and this is Atlanta history, the most important strike for the economy of the South was the washerwoman strike here in Atlanta. They fought the city. The city passed laws to fine them, arrested them, harassed them, and you know what they did? They told the city, okay, we'll pay the fine, but you still won't get no laundry. They prevailed. They raised wages for maids, hotel workers, across the board. The economy of the South changed at that moment that they prevailed. Do a little history study on the washerwomen's strike, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But I grew up in the North, in a closed shop state. When I went to work at Ford, I put in the application, filled it out. They took me over to the union office, and they asked me, would you like to join the union? I said yes. They took me back to HR, told me what my hours and my pay was going to be and when to report to work. If I had said no, they would have said, thank you, we'll keep your application on file. It was a closed shop. You didn't work there unless you were going to become a part of the union. The beauty of unions in the South is, although it is right to work state, and I hate it, your only protection here is being in a union. The beauty of the union workers here in Atlanta and Georgia is that it's voluntary. So we know where you're coming from when you join the union, and you're an active part of the union. And it's growing because people see what we do. Maynard Jackson used to say, a rising tide raises all boats. Labor has raised everybody's vote. We've got to change so many things. It is ridiculous that Georgia has a $5.15 minimum wage that some people, how can you can't even get to work on $5.15 an hour? But we've got to have get people to rise up. You know, we're always quoting Martin Luther King and this and that, and he said a lot of great things. But I remember one thing he said, nobody can ride your back if you stand up straight and you're not bent over. So it is time for labor and people to rise up.
Well, that's a complicated question about why the South is anti-labor. I think it's been anti-labor since the colonial period, since slavery, since what you were talking about, Maurice, at the very beginning. I think that degrades labor. That makes and then you right at the formation of that is the white supremacy that has gone along with it, and that ideology is incredibly flexible and malleable, and it keeps reinventing itself in new ways throughout our history. So you have that during the slavery era, then you have another version of it, you know, after Reconstruction that reasserts itself. In the early 1900s, it's there. You know, it's the reaction to the New Deal in the 1930s, or following the 1930s, coming up in the 1940s and 50s, and sort of the way that people, white politicians, are able to exploit racial divisions, sort of use the civil rights movement as a weapon against the unions in a way, and which is really shocking, but it shows the power of that idea. I think that plays a big role in it, historically speaking. It just seems to be able to reinvent itself continually in our history.
Exactly right. The legacy of slavery and racism right here in good old Georgia is still happening right now. And so as we begin to really organize, we're looking at the power of not just workers, but the power of women and the power of Black women. And when you look at even this election that is approaching, I was looking at numbers yesterday, and it said in a nonpartisan way that this election will be based on the vote of Black women once again, and how, as Georgia goes, goes the rest of the country, that the battle will be here. And so it's only fitting that it's once again on the backs of Black women who have had to bend their backs, but also had to organize. So as we continue the legacy of organizing our votes and organizing our people, it really is about acknowledging the history of this slave state and understanding that people are feeling threatened because the population is shifting, and people of color will be people of power here in the South. And so I'm inviting people to move to the South. As you find your relatives, I want them to keep moving and keep registering and keep voting and keep organizing their unions.
So let me, and the reason I asked that question and I wanted to kind of put that in the crosshairs is because what we're talking about is free labor. Okay, so we're talking about a political economy that is based on free labor. And I want to put this in context for this particular reason. You know, you hear a lot of conversations around the city, around the Chattahoochee Brickyard and debt peonage and, the school to prison, pipeline or nexus or the criminal enterprise. I'm just blanking on the prison, the prison pipeline. But the thing about it is this: if you understand the history of Georgia, you know that the state of Georgia owned enslaved people to build the railroads. So this is the thing. This is where I'm going with this. When I was talking about the long civil rights movement, one of the things that we have to understand about civil rights is that the civil rights was not a movement in the American South. The civil rights was not a movement just in the United States. It was a worldwide movement. But the way in which it plays out on the ground, it's based on the political economies of places where they are. So if you think about looking at the American South, and you go into the Carolinas, you're talking about tobacco. That's the issue that we're talking about in labor. You go to the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, you're talking about the longshoremen, you're talking about the fishermen, you're talking about those that work the shipyards. You go into Georgia, inward Georgia, you're talking about transportation. Go into Alabama, you're talking about iron ore. You go into the Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas Gulf Coast, you're talking about oil and gas. What I'm saying is that when you start pushing for civil and human rights, it plays itself out differently based on the locales. Yeah. But all of them have labor at the center. And so in moving through this, I want to move this through from the 1900s to the 1920s. We talk about A. Philip Randolph. The work that A. Philip Randolph was able to do in terms of organizing the car porters is significant, but also what a lot of folks don't know is that in 1941, A. Philip Randolph called for a protest that was supposed to be the original March on Washington. And what happens is there's an issue where black communities and other working communities realized that they were not allowed to argue for defense contracts. They were not allowed to get the same kind of jobs in the military. I mean, this is just basic stuff. And A. Philip Randolph is able to put the kind of pressure on Franklin Delano Roosevelt to where Franklin Delano Roosevelt bends and gives this union what they ask for. But it doesn't work like that when we move into the 1960s and we see the actual March on Washington in 1963. And so with this being said, let's talk about the early moments of civil rights when we see labor. And I'm really talking about, what's going on in North Carolina. I'm talking about the furniture shops. I'm talking about the great migrations, because that's where we see the issues is when black folk leave the American South, go to the Midwest, and then strive to have jobs and are able to do better for themselves, but it's not all fair and equitable. So if you all, can you talk about areas in which you've seen, labor unions have worked, but they've had their own set of issues too. Can you talk about those?
Well, my family started off in Alabama. We ended up in New York, Ohio, Michigan, as many know. Ford was going to build a plant in Alabama, but they refused to hire black workers. So Ford refused to build a plant. So a lot of my family moved up north to where there were plants. So they migrated north. Now we're having a great return to the South because things have changed, but not much. We're still facing some of the same things that...
Here in the classroom, and then you answer it in 150 words. So you have to be smarter than, giving them the time to do these different things. But as a historian, and a historian bases things on facts, and facts come from an archive. One of the problems that we see is that there will be a whole set of archives that will be fabricated by artificial intelligence. And many of us won't know the difference between the two. So what we have to do is, and this is my opinion, I'm thinking about, well, I won't go there. My opinion is that we have to really bring all aspects of life back to humanity. We have to put people first. We have to put people over profit. We have to put people over politics. And we really have to invest back into human beings. Most recently, one of the inventors of artificial intelligence is now saying, oh my God, we've opened Pandora's box. Well, you knew what you did when you did it. And so with this being, what I would articulate about this is we cannot allow for machines to substitute what human beings can do in terms of emotional intelligence. That's where we have to go, and we have to convince people that it's not all about money. You got to put people first. And that's organizing within itself.
I would add to that that a lot of the jobs that when you're talking about building a society, you're going to need human beings to continue to build. So teaching young people a trade and making sure that they get into apprenticeship programs is essential versus college. And of course we're in a university and we want people to come to Georgia State University and all the Atlanta University Center. However, we also need to make sure that our community is also exposed to the trades and that the trades actually let them in, because the hands that are needed to rebuild this country, to take out the lead pipes, to make sure that there's solar panels on the roof, those are jobs for human beings. And if we don't protect those and preserve those and make sure that the next generation that are more black and brown get those jobs and get that training, we won't have the skill set that we need. So I don't think all jobs are going to be AI, but I think we need to have some AI involvement in just about everything we're doing. We need to analyze what happens to the workers, what happens to even the construction workers on an AI project. So it's complicated, but investing in the human beings, you always win, right?
I'll just add into that. With labor unions, you have organization, you have power collectively. That power can shape policies of the government if you're organized. So you can have industrial policies that what Ms. Scott is talking about valuing people, about having programs to provide for workers who are displaced by technological unemployment. But a union job, you may have technological unemployment, but you're going to get technological unemployment from a non-union job. And the difference being that in a union situation, you'll have benefits. The union will have a say in how this process occurs. And then also collectively, you can shape the political system to make it more conscious of these issues, which is a huge problem in this country. Now, when you were asking that question, I always go back to Alabama, but I think there was one coal company in Alabama. Alabama had this may shock a lot of people, but something like 90-some% of the coal miners in that state were union, which puts it at a level that you would see maybe in western Pennsylvania, maybe in West Virginia at the height of the unionization, big-time coal-producing states, right? So Alabama's unionization rate in the coal industry was very high, and then after World War II, you had this decline, and one of the first companies that shut down was the one holdout. Alabama Fuel and Iron, the one company that resisted, used every tactic in the book, violence, racism, white supremacy, all of it. It's like a textbook for how that works. They're one of the first companies that shuts down. And so those miners were all non-union. And what they told those miners, by the way, what the president of the company, Prince DeBartolome, and I wrote about this in my book, what he told these workers was, go and see if you can get a pension from the UMW. That's what he told them when he shut down his company. And so union versus non-union, at least with a union, you have, in this issue, you have some say, you have some collective power, and you can shape the wider society through that.
Is there another question? We got room for one or two more. And since we're talking about religious organizations and, communities coming together, as they say where I'm from, will there be another? So I need one more question.
I have a question. How many people in the room have come from union families or have been members of a union themselves? Okay. And did it change your life and change your family's life? Okay.
I was telling, we had a meeting earlier, and I was telling them that I don't come from working class people. I come from informal economy people. So hustlers. bootleggers and number runners and conjure people and all kind of different things. And it provides a very different kind of perspective because to be blue collar at that point in time was considered to be like a step up. And then we start getting into class formation and stratification. It gets to be something totally different. But it's all one of the things that I learned when I got involved with the GEO at the University of Illinois and I studied under one of the top labor historians in the world, a guy named David Roediger. What I learned is that labor union work was respectable work. It was work it was honest work is what it was. That's how they would put it. It was honest work. And so that's how it changed my life.
Wow. I wonder what your family thinks of you now.
Well, my parents were the first to go to college, and they set a different track in terms of what we could do and what would happen. I mean, they never pitted us against the other family. It was just, there are other ways of doing things. And so it's always interesting for me to go back and be around them now because they're like, y'all made it, But, they're good, complicated, but honest people. They just, it is what it is.
So I just want to leave you all with a couple of things. One, get involved. We have to make a difference. Get involved. I mean, this is the urgency of now call, if you will. Our rights are really under attack. Our body's under attack. Our life is under attack. The country's under attack. Values are under attack. The family's under attack. Everything. So, I mean, there's only 24 hours in a day, so whether it's working with the labor union or working with an organization like Georgia Stand Up, get involved. We need you. We need your voice. We need your hands. We need your minds. And if not, give us your money. We need that too.
Well, if all hearts and minds are clear, ladies and gentlemen and all in between, let's give a round of applause for this wonderful panel. And Madam Chair, I yield back my time.
Thank you all so much for such a wonderful discussion. I'm so glad we were able to gather here today to hear your thoughts on such important issues. Thanks so much to our audience. Please help yourself to refreshments and take some time to look at the exhibit. It's going to be up here for the next year, but we also have a digital exhibit hosted by the Digital Library of Georgia. Thank you all so much.